Okay, well, thank you all for coming. So I don't think I'll take up the full 60 minutes for talking, but I'll probably go about 45, 50 minutes. So this is going to be some past research of mine, but also ongoing research. And I think will be a good introduction to some of my work. Okay, so if you spend enough time in the world of consciousness research, you'll occasionally hear claims like the following. A human is more conscious than a fish. If snails are conscious, they're only a little conscious. Babies are actually more conscious than we are as adults. It may be that today's large neural networks are slightly conscious. So let's set aside for the moment the question of whether any of these claims are true. What I'm interested in, what I want to know is, do these claims even make sense? And that question turns on the question of whether consciousness comes in degrees. If the answer is yes, then that means that some entities are more conscious than other entities, either some creatures or mental states. And if the answer is no, then that means that these sorts of claims are either false or incoherent. And if you look in the consciousness literature, you'll see that a lot of people have assumed that the answer is yes. There have been many articles in both the philosophy and the science of consciousness that have taken it to be obvious that consciousness comes in degrees, or that at least express sympathy for the idea. In fact, the idea of degrees of consciousness, it's been invoked as a starting point for constructing any empirical measure of consciousness, or as a basic constraint for mapping the structure of consciousness, even as a fundamental axiom for any theory of consciousness. But there's also a number of people who have been skeptical. So some have contended that the idea of degrees of consciousness doesn't really make sense. And these people have said things like, the notion of degrees of consciousness is of dubious coherence. If we ask, is a human more conscious than an octopus? The question barely makes sense. Consciousness isn't the sort of property that can come in degrees, so we can't make sense of degrees of phenomenal consciousness. And there's two arguments in particular that have been especially compelling and influential on the no side. But before I get to those, I'll mention that actually one other person on the no side is a past version of myself. In a short commentary paper from a few years ago, I said that I think it's best to avoid talk of degrees of consciousness, at least until we have a better idea of what this is supposed to mean. And it's not clear that this is a meaningful notion. So what has convinced all these people that have been skeptical of degrees of consciousness? Well, there's two major lines of influence. One is what I'll call the determinacy objection. To be conscious is to have a subjective point of view, but having a subjective point of view doesn't come in degrees. And the other is what I'll call the multidimensionality objection. Consciousness is multidimensional, so the set of conscious states isn't orderable, but orderability is a necessary condition for coming in degrees. So I'm going to say much more about both of these arguments in a moment, but to stay on the big picture for now, how we answer this question, does consciousness come in degrees? It really matters for consciousness research. Because if the answer is yes, then, well, maybe any theory of consciousness ought to be capturing its degreed structure, and maybe empirical measures of consciousness ought to be graded rather than binary. Whereas if the answer is no, then maybe we should abandon one of the basic theoretical assumptions that has driven a great amount of consciousness research. If the skeptics are right, then a lot of consciousness research is just fundamentally confused. Maybe that long list of articles on the slide illustrating the yes perspective, maybe we can just toss all those articles in the trash. So my talk today is going to walk you through some of the path that I've taken in arriving at what I now think is the correct view on this issue. And to give you a sense of where I'll be going, I'll briefly articulate the basic idea behind my view. So basically, I don't think either of these perspectives, the yes or the no, fully gets things right, although I'm going to end up much more on the side of yes than on the side of no. So, on my view, the question of whether consciousness comes in degrees, it's not something that can be settled simply via conceptual analysis. In other words, I don't think any a priori philosophical argument can either validate or invalidate views that postulate degrees of consciousness. Instead, I think that to figure out whether consciousness comes in degrees, we need to first better understand what consciousness is. And if you wanted to condense my view into a single slogan, it would be this: to be more conscious is to have more of whatever consciousness is. Now, we don't know what consciousness is yet. Obviously, there are many different theories of consciousness that differ on which property they identify consciousness with. And so, because of that, we don't know yet whether some creatures can be more conscious than others, at least on my view. But I'm also going to give some reasons at the very end of this talk for thinking that most theories of consciousness actually entail that consciousness comes in degrees. And that's the sense in which I think proponents of degrees of consciousness are closer to the truth than the skeptics. Okay, so that's the plan for the talk. Now, there's a few papers of mine that the content of this talk draws from. The main one is a paper called Degrees of Consciousness that came out last year in the Philosophy Journal News. Another top piece of mine that I'm going to talk about and bring up that intersects a lot is a forthcoming piece called The Light in the Room. That will be the opening chapter for a new course book in philosophy of mind. And then there's a few other research articles that are in progress that I'm working on dimensions of consciousness, on the semantics of gradable conscious constructions, and on global states of consciousness that will intersect with my talk today. Okay, so let me start by giving a name to the main thesis that I'm interested in and clarifying that thesis. So I'm going to just use the phrase degrees thesis to express the view that consciousness comes in degrees. And the degrees thesis, on the way I'm using these terms, is roughly synonymous with the following. Some entities are more conscious than others. Consciousness comes in greater or lesser extents. There are levels of consciousness. Consciousness is graded. Now, a couple initial points of clarification. So first, the degrees thesis is about phenomenal consciousness. So it shouldn't be confused with the claim that some non-phenomenal senses of consciousness, like, for example, wakefulness, come in degrees. And that's important because sometimes you hear people say, well, it's obvious that consciousness comes in degrees since a fully awake person is more conscious than a sleeping person. But it's obvious that wakefulness comes in degrees. It's not obvious that phenomenal consciousness comes in degrees. And we shouldn't automatically assume that degrees of wakefulness are going to correspond to degrees of phenomenal consciousness. Second, the claim that consciousness comes in degrees shouldn't be confused with the claim that some features of consciousness come in degrees. So it's obvious that features of consciousness, like intensity or vivacity or precision or complexity, those come in degrees. But it's not obvious that consciousness itself comes in degrees. So as an analogy, think about how some features of trees come in degrees. For example, height or age or number of leaves. But treehood itself doesn't come in degrees. One thing can't be more tree than another. That doesn't make sense. So sometimes you see people say that, well, of course, consciousness comes in degrees because some experiences are more vivid or precise or complex than others. But that would be to confuse degreed features of consciousness with degrees of consciousness itself. Okay, so that's just some basic clarification for what the target of my talk is going to be. And here's the structure for the talk. So I've already introduced the topic and my view on the topic. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to return to those two objections that we saw at the beginning, the determinacy objection and the multidimensionality objection. And I'm going to explain why I think those objections can't work, why they're unsustainable and will lead to some absurd consequences. And then after that, I'm going to provide my positive analysis of degrees of consciousness. Okay. Now, if you look in the literature on this topic, then there's one paper that stands out in terms of especially its impact and influence. And that's a paper from 2016 by Bain, Hoey, and Owen called Are There Levels of Consciousness? And this is a paper that's expressing skepticism, that's criticizing the idea of degrees of consciousness. So the authors say the following to characterize the target of their criticism. They say, this idea of degrees of consciousness is frequently expressed in consciousness science. For example, consciousness is described as involving a scale ranging from total unconsciousness to vivid wakefulness as a continuous variable and as being graded rather than being an all or none property, and individuals as ordered on the basis of how conscious they are. And then they go on and present their main criticism to this view. They say, the notion of degrees of consciousness is of dubious coherence. According to the standard conception of consciousness, a creature is conscious if and only if it possesses a subjective point of view. Arguably, the property of having a subjective point of view is not gradable. It cannot come in degrees. So, in essence, they're expressing a version of what I call the determinacy objection. They're saying an entity either is conscious or not. There is no middle ground. Even if an entity has only a sliver of feeling, that entity still counts as being conscious. So therefore, it doesn't make sense to say that consciousness comes in degrees. Now, when I first encountered this argument, I found it quite compelling. I mean, that's partly why I wrote that short commentary paper a few years ago expressing sympathy for the no perspective. But as I thought about it more, I realized that there must be something wrong with this argument. And that's easy to see when we see that we can construct structurally analogous arguments with the same inferential patterns, but with obviously false conclusions. So here's an example of what I mean. Consider the following absurd argument about size. An entity either has size or not. There is no middle ground. Even if an entity occupies only a tiny region of space, that entity still counts as having size. So therefore, it doesn't make sense to say that size comes in degrees. So obviously the conclusion is false because size does come in degrees. But the inferential structure of these two arguments is exactly the same. So what that means is that whatever is going on in the determinacy objection, it can't be a valid inference pattern. And there's nothing special about size here. You could substitute in just about any other degree property, for example, mass, velocity, temperature, and so forth. And you'll be able to construct similar types of arguments. So what exactly has gone wrong with this argument? Well, here's my diagnosis. I think that the determinacy objection is conflating two distinct questions. One question is, does consciousness come in degrees? But the other question is about indeterminacy. Can it be a matter of degree whether an entity is conscious? And the distinction between these two questions is a bit subtle at first, but it's easy to see that these questions are distinct when we consider a table that fills out each of the different possibilities here. So let me go through some examples. First, consider mass. It's never a matter of degree whether something has mass. Everything either has mass or it doesn't have mass. But mass comes in degrees. Some things have more mass than others. So mass is determinate and degreed. By contrast, consider being a quark. It's never a matter of degree whether something is a quark. Everything either is or isn't a quark. But quarkhood doesn't come in degrees. One thing can't be more quark than another. So that means that quarkhood is determinate. It's never a matter of degree, but it's dichotomous. It doesn't come in degrees. On the other hand, think about warmness. So it can be a matter of degree whether something is warm, and also warmness comes in degrees. So warmness is indeterminate or allows for indeterminacy, and it's also degree. And finally, think about treehood. It can be a matter of degree, whether something is a tree. Think about, for example, the gradual process as a seed turns into a tree. And treehood doesn't come in degrees. One thing can't be more tree than another. So treehood allows for indeterminacy, but is dichotomous. So what this shows is that the question of whether a property comes in degrees is just logically independent from the question of whether it's sometimes a matter of degree, whether an entity has that property. Here's another way of illustrating the point. Here's a visual illustration of the distinction between degrees and determinacy. So you could imagine a world where every entity is either determinately conscious or determinately not conscious. Yet you might still think that consciousness comes in degrees in such a world. And I think this is really important because I think the conflation between indeterminacy and degrees, it generates a lot of confusion in the consciousness literature. And that's because some work that talks of degrees of consciousness focuses on indeterminacy, but other work that talks of degrees of consciousness focuses on degrees. And I mean, that would be fine if the literatures were themselves appropriately divided, but the actual situation is much messier. Articles that are on one issue draw upon or criticize arguments concerning the other, usually with no indication that the issues are distinct. And in most cases, degrees and indeterminacy are just treated interchangeably, which leaves it unclear which issue is really at stake and which arguments are really relevant. So before I go on, let me just make one other point that I think can help clarify our thinking on this issue. And that's actually just a grammatical point that also pertains to the determinacy objection. So the point here is that when we're talking about degree properties, it's important to be careful about what kinds of grammatical constructions we're using. And in particular, there's a difference between using degree modifiers on noun phrases versus on gerund phrases. So for example, it's infelicitous to say having mass comes in degrees. That's not the case because everything either has mass or doesn't. But it's perfectly fine to say mass comes in degrees. So there's a semantic difference between using the gerund term on the left and the noun term on the right. And the reason is that the sentence having mass comes in degrees, that's actually expressing the proposition that it's a matter of degree, or it can be a matter of degree, whether something has mass, rather than the proposition that mass comes in degrees. So similarly, I think it's fine from a semantic point of view to say consciousness comes in degrees, even though it's infelicitous to say being conscious comes in degrees or having a subjective point of view comes in degrees. And oftentimes the indeterminacy objection is expressed using the observation that we can't say being conscious or having a subjective point of view come in degrees. But that doesn't yet show that consciousness doesn't come in degrees, since those sentences express different propositions. Okay, one last thing I'll say in regards to determinacy is just one more illustration of how this comes up in the relevant literature. So to take one more example, there's a recent book by Peter Carruthers called Human and Animal Minds, The Consciousness Questions Laid to Rest. And this book has gotten like a decent amount of press in the last few years. So the central thesis of this book is consciousness is all or nothing. And if you've listened to my talk or have thought about these sorts of things, you might read this sentence and ask yourself, okay, what does that sentence mean? Is it about degrees or is it about indeterminacy? Is it saying that some entities, that no entities are more conscious than others? Or is it saying that it's never a matter of degree whether an entity is conscious, that there are no borderline cases of consciousness? Well, if you go on and keep reading, Carruthers is actually clear on what he means by this thesis. He says, either a mental state is like something for its subject to undergo, or it is not. Phenomenal consciousness is either categorically present or categorically absent. Phenomenal concepts are sharp rather than vague. And these sentences all indicate and make it clear that he's meaning to make a claim about determinacy. He's saying that the concept of phenomenal consciousness is determinate. But the problem is that from these claims, Carruthers makes inferences about the viability of degrees of consciousness. He says things like, we can't make sense of degrees of phenomenal consciousness. It's incoherent to say that a bee is to some small degree phenomenally conscious or conscious to some small extent, and that theories that entail the degrees thesis, for example, IAT, are philosophically untenable. And the problem is that even if these claims in the middle, in orange, are true, you can't infer these claims at the bottom, in blue, because the notion that is being expressed by the claims in the middle, determinacy, is just compatible with either accepting or rejecting degrees. So that's just one more example of how this conflation between degrees and indeterminacy arises in the consciousness literature. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about determinacy. And I think what this shows is that this objection just doesn't work. The inference pattern is just invalid. So let's turn then to the other objection, the multidimensionality objection. The objection says consciousness is multidimensional, so the set of conscious states isn't orderable. But orderability is a necessary condition for coming into degrees. You sometimes see this objection in print, and I've had a few people express this objection to me in discussion. And again, one famous example of this objection in the literature is from the Bain, Hoey, and Ohm paper I mentioned earlier. They say, although the idea of degrees of consciousness entails that one conscious state must be absolutely higher than another conscious state, we see no reason to grant that claim. The conscious state associated with REM sleep might be higher than that associated with sedation on some dimensions, whereas the opposite might be the case on other dimensions. So they have this diagram that's supposed to illustrate this point. The idea behind the diagram is that it's supposed to be illustrating 8 different dimensions of consciousness and how 2 different conscious states, that associated with dreaming and that associated with sedation, how those 2 conscious states map onto this multidimensional space. And what they're saying is, well, maybe it'll turn out to be the case that the sedation state is higher on dimensions 1, 2, 3, and 4, but the dreaming state is higher on dimensions 5, 7, and 8. And if that's the situation, then we just have no basis for saying that either of those conscious states is more conscious than the other conscious state. Okay, so that's an expression of the multidimensionality objection. Now, to develop my argument and my criticism of this objection, I actually made a diagram of my own. My diagram is a little bit more simple. So my diagram is depicting the sizes of different fruit. So size measured in length and width, those are 2 different dimensions of size. And there's 4 different fruit in my diagram. There's blueberry, apple, banana, and watermelon. And as you can see from the diagram, blueberry is very small, apple and banana are in the middle, watermelon's really big. Okay, so let me make 3 points with this diagram. First point, size is multidimensional. I mean, that's pretty obvious. Its dimensions are length, width, and depth. Second point, some pairs of sized objects aren't orderable in the very same sense in which some pairs of conscious states might not be orderable. In particular, there are some pairs of objects, pairs of fruit, such that neither is bigger than the other with respect to size. Because if you compare apple and banana, well, apple is wider, but banana is longer, so neither is strictly bigger than the other. But third point, size still comes in degrees. It's still the case that watermelon is bigger than apple is bigger than blueberry. So these are all pretty obvious observations, but I think these observations show that there's something wrong with the multidimensionality objection. It shows that multidimensionality is compatible with coming in degrees. And in fact, this point is really obvious when we observe that there's many properties that are just both degreed and multidimensional, not just size, but also health, velocity, athleticism, maybe consciousness. So what this means is that multidimensionality just isn't a good reason to reject the degrees thesis. There are just clear counterexamples that show that these 2 structural properties are compatible with each other. And at this point, this might seem a little bit puzzling, at least the theoretical dialectical situation. Because you might be wondering, what are people who have been expressing the multidimensionality objection thinking, given that multidimensionality and degrees are just compatible with each other, as these examples show? I mean, when you consider these sorts of examples, the point just seems rather obvious. Well, I have a diagnosis of what might be going on. I have an explanation for why it is that some people, philosophers especially, have thought that there's something incoherent about the idea of degrees of consciousness. An explanation that actually goes beyond my criticism of the determinacy objection and the multidimensionality objection. So something I've come to think in the last year or two is that there are actually two different senses of the term phenomenal consciousness. And one of these senses does allow for degrees of consciousness, but the other doesn't. So to explain these two senses, let me start with a metaphor. The metaphor is to be conscious is for the lights to be on inside. Now, I think this is a good metaphor. Sometimes people poke fun at metaphors like this, but I think this is a perfectly respectful way of talking and thinking about consciousness. But one thing I've realized is that there are actually two different ways of interpreting this metaphor. And the distinction matters for thinking about degrees of consciousness. And to see these two different interpretations, we can ask, what exactly is consciousness within this metaphor? Well, I think there's two different answers we could give. One answer is that consciousness is the inner light itself. If we're thinking of consciousness in this way, then we could define consciousness as what makes an entity feel like something at all, what makes an entity feel some way at all. But the other answer is that consciousness is the illuminated room. And if we think of consciousness in this way, then we can define consciousness as the way an entity feels. So let's use subjectivity to mean the first interpretation of consciousness, where consciousness is analogous to the inner light. And let's use phenomenal character to mean the second interpretation, where consciousness is analogous to the illuminated room. Now, I think these are both perfectly fine ways of interpreting the term phenomenally conscious. A few people I've met have been skeptical of this distinction and have said to me, it's obvious which of these is the right interpretation of consciousness. Although the problem is that different people have differed on which interpretation is supposed to be obviously correct. So I think that's evidence that both of these are okay. And just to make sure that you will get a feel for this distinction, let me apply it to a concrete example. So consider global workspace theory. In fact, that's a paradigm case of a theory where some people have asserted it doesn't allow for degrees of consciousness. So according to global workspace theory, what it is for an entity to be conscious is for it to have a global workspace, basically a central executive system whose information is available for use by a broad range of other cognitive systems. So suppose global workspace theory is true. Well, we could ask then, what exactly is consciousness according to the theory? And there's two permissible answers here. One answer is that consciousness is the global workspace itself. And that's a pretty natural answer, since having a global workspace is what draws the line between conscious entities and non-conscious entities. But another answer you could give is that consciousness is not only the global workspace itself, but also the representations in the global workspace alongside the global workspace itself. And that's also a fair answer, because if we want to know what it's like to be an entity, then we need to know not only about the global workspace itself, but also about which representations are inside the global workspace. So this is an example of how this distinction between subjectivity and phenomenal character naturally arises on what's probably the most prominent theory of consciousness in contemporary consciousness research. But actually, there's nothing special about global workspace theory. This is just an instance of a more general pattern. And that's because the distinction between subjectivity and phenomenal character it arises across basically every theory of consciousness. For example, here are some prominent theories of consciousness across both the science and the philosophy of consciousness. And here's what those theories identify subjectivity with, and what those theories identify phenomenal character with. Okay, so let me return now to degrees. What I've been saying is that I think consciousness, in the phenomenal sense, is ambiguous between expressing subjectivity and expressing phenomenal character. And I think this really matters for thinking about degrees of consciousness. And the reason is that questions about degrees of consciousness look different depending on whether we're talking about subjectivity or about phenomenal character. So first, suppose we think of consciousness as subjectivity, as the inner light, as what makes an entity feel like something at all. Well, then it's not obvious that consciousness is multidimensional. And it seems like a live possibility that consciousness comes in degrees. In fact, thinking in the metaphor, you could imagine that the inner light has a dimmer for different brightness settings. So it's not merely on or off, but maybe there are other parameters like color or texture. That at least seems like a live possibility. It seems like maybe the inner light shines more brightly in some creatures than others. So if we're thinking of consciousness as subjectivity, then the notion of degrees of consciousness seems to make sense. But if we're thinking of consciousness as phenomenal character, as the illuminated room, as the way an entity feels, well, then it's obvious that consciousness is multidimensional. And it also seems like the idea of degrees of consciousness might be ill-founded. I mean, what would it mean for the illuminated room to come in degrees? Sometimes I hear people say, oh, maybe we can think of size of the room as a measure of degrees of consciousness. I think actually there's good reasons to think that that's not a good way of interpreting this metaphor, and that it will lead to itself absurd results. But I won't talk about that here. If anybody wants to ask about that in Q&A, I'm happy to discuss it there. So here's why I think this distinction is important. I suspect that some skeptics of degrees of consciousness are thinking of consciousness as phenomenal character rather than as subjectivity. I think this is part of why some people have appealed to multidimensionality to argue against the degrees thesis, even though that's clearly not a good argument when we see that many multidimensional properties are themselves degreed. My hypothesis is that those who appeal to multidimensionality to argue that the notion of degrees of consciousness doesn't make sense are trying to express phenomenal character. And in that sense, they're right in that the way an entity feels doesn't come in degrees. The way you feel can't be greater than the way that I feel. But then the problem is that the sense of consciousness that's relevant to degrees is subjectivity. That's, I think, the sense of consciousness that those who have talked about degrees of consciousness have in mind. The property that makes an entity feel some way at all, the inner light. So here's the upshot. If all of this is right, then I think there's an explanation for why some people find the idea of degrees of consciousness incoherent. But that explanation is actually compatible with the degrees thesis itself. So in other words, there's indeed a sense of consciousness, namely phenomenal character, whereby consciousness doesn't come in degrees, but there's also a sense of consciousness, namely subjectivity. And that's the sense that's relevant here, in which it may very well come in degrees. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the multidimensionality objection and these objections in general. And that covers the first part of this talk. So there's these two objections that have been influential in the consciousness literature as arguments against degrees of consciousness, the indeterminacy objection and the multidimensionality objection. But what I've argued is that the determinacy objection conflates two distinct questions. Does consciousness come in degrees? Meaning, are some entities more conscious than others? And can it be a matter of degree of whether some entities are conscious? Meaning, are there borderline cases of consciousness? Are there cases where there's no fact to the matter as to whether an entity is conscious at all? And I've argued that the multidimensionality objection is just making a false assumption about the relationship between multidimensionality and degrees, because there are many properties that are both multidimensional and degreed. So multidimensionality is not a good argument against degrees. So I think that shows that neither of these arguments works. But you might still wonder, how should we think about degrees of consciousness? What I've done so far is I produced two negative arguments. I basically defended the conceptual coherence of degrees of consciousness. But I still haven't really said much yet about what exactly it would mean for consciousness to come in degrees, or how we can assess whether that's the case. So that's what I'm going to do in the remainder of this talk. I'm going to present my positive analysis of what it would be for consciousness to come in degrees. And then at the very end, I'll apply it to a couple cases. So for purposes of time, I'm going to just express the basic ideas. If you want a more developed explication of my view and of these kinds of arguments in general, you can look at my degrees of consciousness paper. Okay, so let me start with the core idea behind my view. And that core idea can be expressed with the slogan I mentioned earlier in the talk. To be more conscious is to have more of whatever consciousness is. I think that this simple slogan basically captures the essence of what it would be for consciousness to come in degrees. And the basic idea here is that for any theory of consciousness, we can fill in the blank for a statement of this form. For X to be conscious, just as for X to be blank, to have a global workspace, to have some number of hyper thoughts, to have a maximal degree of integrated information, to have recurrent processing in the brain, to have an internal world model, to be acquainted with sense data or external objects, or to bear the experiential representation attitude to some set of propositions. Those are all different popular theories of consciousness today. So fill in the blank with whatever you want. And then after we fill in the blank, we can ask, is that property that's in the blank something that can be possessed to a greater or lesser degree by different creatures? So that gives you a flavor of how I'm thinking about things. But we can also make this more systematic. So I'm basically going to go through my analysis in stages where it'll go from being more and more intuitive and informal to more and more formal and precise. So here's what I'll do in the next slide, in the next stage. I'm going to make 4 observations that I think express conditions on degrees of consciousness, meaning that they're observations that have to be satisfied if it is the case that consciousness comes in degrees. And then after that, I'm going to turn those observations into a more precise philosophical analysis. Okay, so 4 observations. Each observation is going to be in the form of a conditional. If consciousness comes in degrees, then some condition has to hold. So let me go through them. First observation. If it is the case that consciousness comes in degrees, then differences in degrees of consciousness should entail differences in phenomenology. So, for example, let's say that you and I differ in our degree of consciousness. Well, if that's the case, then what it's like to be you should be different from what it's like to be me. If that weren't the case, then it would be unclear why the relevant degree property should count as degree of consciousness rather than degree of something else. In other words, if you and I could be phenomenal duplicates, yet different degree of consciousness, I feel like on that kind of view, I just wouldn't understand what degree of consciousness is even supposed to mean. Okay, so that's the first observation. Second observation, if consciousness comes in degrees, then degrees of consciousness should correspond to some dimension of phenomenal similarity. So here's an example. Take 3 people. Let's say, for example, that Ryota is more conscious than Hiro, and that Hiro is more conscious than me. Well, if that's the case, then we should expect that what it's like to be Ryota is more similar in some respect to what it's like to be hero than what it's like to be me. So in other words, degree of consciousness should track some dimension of phenomenal similarity. Again, if that weren't the case, then it's arguable that whatever degree property we're talking about wouldn't really be degree of consciousness. So I think these first two criteria are pretty straightforward to identify. They're pretty intuitive. I think they're just conceptual conditions on what it would take for something to be degree of consciousness. The third criterion is a little bit more subtle and will take a little bit more work to explain. So the third criterion says that if consciousness comes in degrees, then anything with a positive degree of consciousness is conscious simplicator, meaning is simply conscious. So let me explain this by first drawing some comparisons with other degreed properties. So think for a moment about circularity. Circularity comes in degrees. Some shapes are more circular than others. And there's also the property of being a circle, the property expressed using a gerund term. And we could ask, how high of a degree of circularity does something have to have in order to be a circle? And the answer is that it has to have a maximal degree of circularity. If a shape is less than maximally circular, then it's not a circle, it's just an oval or some other weird shape. By contrast, think about mass. Mass doesn't work the same way. If we ask, what is the relationship between degrees of mass and having mass? The answer is not that to have mass, you have to have a maximal degree of mass. That doesn't even make sense. Instead, all that's required for an entity to count as having mass is that it has a minimal degree of mass. Anything with a positive mass value has mass. And as an intermediate case, think about warmness. So there's degrees of warmness and there's the property of being warm. And in order for something to count as being warm, it has to have more than a minimal degree of warmness. But it doesn't need to have maximal warmness. It just has to surpass some intermediate threshold. Okay, so then we could ask, what is the analogous question? Or what is the analogous situation for consciousness? If consciousness comes in degrees, then what should we expect about the relationship between degrees of consciousness and being conscious? And if you think about it for a moment, it's clear that consciousness is kind of like mass. If consciousness comes in degrees, then any entity with a positive degree of consciousness, with a non-zero degree of consciousness, is conscious. I mean, that's just the way that our concept of consciousness works. That's the way that we use the term conscious. That's how we think about the relationship between degrees of consciousness and being conscious. And this is why some people say things like, even if an entity is barely conscious, even if an entity has just a sliver of feeling, that entity still counts as being conscious. So this just seems like a conceptual truth about consciousness. So that's the third observation. And then the fourth observation is something we've already seen. It's just the slogan of my view. If consciousness comes in degrees, then what it is to be more conscious is to have more of whatever consciousness is. Okay. So I think all these observations are quite intuitive. In fact, I think these are all just conceptual truths. But I think what's cool is that these observations actually place constraints on what it takes for a degree property to be degree of consciousness. And in fact, I think that these observations give us the ingredients we need for a more systematic analysis of degrees of consciousness. So let me walk you through that. So suppose that we have the following situation. We have some degree property, and we want to know, is this degree property degree of consciousness? Can we permissibly, defensively say that it's degree of consciousness? We could ask this for any degree phenomenal property, like, or any degree property whatsoever. We could ask whether degrees of attention or intensity or maybe maximal phi values, or maybe size of global workspace, or a number of high order thoughts, whether those can count as degree of consciousness. So that's the question I want to answer. We start with a degree property that we already know is degree, and then we ask, under what conditions is it permissible to think of this as degree of consciousness? And my answer is that three conditions have to be satisfied. These conditions are what I call difference, similarity, and threshold. And I'll just quickly walk through them. So the first condition, difference, says that if X and Y have different values along that property, I'm going to just call it phi, then what it's like to be X must differ from what it's like to be Y. So basically, difference says that if consciousness comes in degrees, then differences in degrees of consciousness entail differences in phenomenology. And that's just a formalization of this first observation from the previous slide, the observation that's on the left. The second condition, similarity, says that if phi is degree of consciousness, and if X's phi value is greater than Y's phi value is greater than Z's phi value, then it must be the case that X is more phenomenally similar in some way to Y than to Z. So that is just a formalization of the second observation from the previous slide, that degrees of consciousness should correspond to some dimension of phenomenal similarity. And the third condition, the threshold, says that if phi is degree of consciousness, then what it is for an entity to be conscious is for it to have a positive phi value. That's what this expression on the right-hand side is saying. And this is actually combining the third and the fourth observation from the previous slide. So as a reminder, the third observation was that if consciousness comes in degrees, then consciousness is kind of like mass. Anything with a positive degree of consciousness is conscious implicator. And the fourth observation is my slogan: to be more conscious is to have more of whatever consciousness is. That observation is captured using the operator that stands in between the two sides of this expression. That's intended to be a just is operator. The details here are not really important, especially in the context of this talk. It's sort of getting into much more specific questions about different metaphysical relations. But I'll just mention that there's a very deliberate choice of which metaphysical operator I'm using here, and that is intended to do some specific philosophical work. And I will say a little bit about this in a more qualitative way. So the threshold condition here is especially important. And that's because of the role of this operator, the just is operator. Again, this statement is saying for X to have a positive phi value, just is for X to be conscious. That's how you read this thing on the right and the bottom. And the role of this just is statement in the threshold condition is to ensure that degrees of consciousness are connected to the nature of consciousness, to what consciousness ultimately is. That's how this fourth basic observation is satisfied. And the reason this is important is that I think this allows us to solve one of the biggest challenges that arise in thinking about degrees of consciousness. And that's the challenge of determining when a degreed property is merely a degreed feature of consciousness versus degrees of consciousness itself. So as an example, think about vivacity, just to take one case. So perceptual experiences are more vivid than imaginative experiences. Think about the phenomenal contrast between perception and imagination. One thing we could ask is, are more vivid experiences more conscious experiences? And I think that it's not very obvious either way. I mean, if you just think about it introspectively, it's not obvious whether this is just a degreed feature of consciousness or whether more vivid experiences are actually meaningfully thought of as being more conscious experiences. But what the threshold condition does, and what my analysis more generally allows us to do, is to answer this question in a philosophically precise way. And the answer depends on whether the difference between more vivid experiences and less vivid experiences is a matter of more vivid experiences having more of what consciousness is. In other words, we could ask whether having more vivid we could ask whether having an experience with a positive degree of vividness just is being conscious. We could ask whether vividness is connected to the nature of consciousness. And that's how we can answer this question on my view. And I don't think there's any a priori answer here. I think it's going to depend on which theory of consciousness turns out to be correct. But what this is doing is it's providing a procedure by which we can assess these seemingly intractable questions, and a procedure that allows us to go beyond just appealing to intuitions or introspection. The basic idea is to figure out what is the metaphysical nature of consciousness, and then ask, is that something that some creatures have more of than others, or that these experiences have more of than these experiences? Okay, so just to summarize here, what these three formalized conditions are doing on the right-hand side is they're providing an analysis of what it is for some degreed property, call it phi, to be degree of consciousness. And these are intended to be individually necessary and jointly sufficient. What I want to say is that if a degree property satisfies all three of these conditions, and only if it satisfies all three of those conditions, then it counts as degree of consciousness. So in essence, this is the heart of my view. This is like the positive account that I want to pitch for. And as I said, the statement of it on this page is a little bit technical, but once again, if at any point you got lost here, or if you just can't remember all of these different conditions, all you have to really remember to get my view is the slogan of the view. The slogan being, to be more conscious is to have more of whatever consciousness is. Different theories say different things about what consciousness is, so different theories will have different answers as to what it is to be more conscious and whether some entities can be more conscious. Okay. Now, the very last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just briefly consider two different examples of how a degree property could satisfy these criteria and so count as degree of consciousness given my analysis. And I'm not going to go into detail. I'm just going to keep things at a very intuitive and brief level. So two examples. First, let's think about attentional theories. Suppose that consciousness is a matter of attention, as many theories think. And suppose more specifically that what it is for a mental state to be conscious is for it to occupy attention to at least a minimal degree. Well, if that kind of view is true, then it's very natural to think that more attention means more consciousness. So maybe, for example, your foveal visual experience is more conscious than your peripheral visual experience right now because your foveal visual experience occupies more attention than your peripheral visual experience. So I think that's one possibility for how consciousness might come in degrees. And I'm not showing how the three different conditions of my analysis are satisfied, but if you go through it and apply it, I think it's you'll be able to see how each of those conditions comes to be satisfied. To take a very different kind of example, consider atomistic theories of consciousness, meaning theories that take total experiences to be composed from multiple atomic experiences. A lot of contemporary theories of consciousness are atomistic in structure, even if that's not something that people talk about explicitly. And if a theory is atomistic, it's very natural to think that subjects whose total experiences are composed from more atomic experiences are thereby more conscious. If, for example, your total experience is composed from 100 different consciousness atoms and mine is just composed from 10, then it's natural to think that you're more conscious than me. So those are just a couple examples, but I hope they help illustrate how this is supposed to work. Again, a full illustration would involve showing how the different specific conditions of my analysis apply, but I wanted to keep things at an intuitive level and not spend too much time on this slide. And again, the most important idea is just the slogan of my view. To be more conscious is to have more of whatever consciousness is. Now, there's more to be said about these and other examples, but let me take a step back now and make a very general observation to begin closing up the talk. The general observation I want to make is that to confirm the degrees thesis, one has to show that there's some degree property that satisfies the criteria, the difference, similarity, and threshold criteria. But to falsify it, one has to show that no property satisfies these criteria. And given this, I think that it's easier to satisfy the existential statement than the universal negation. In other words, I think it turns out that I think actually arguably most theories entail that there's some degree property that satisfies the criteria. And given that, I think we can make the following speculation. Consciousness probably comes in degrees. I mean, the jury's still out. We still don't know what exactly consciousness is yet. But if you survey the landscape of contemporary theories of consciousness, and if you think about what they say about the nature and structure of consciousness, and if you think carefully about what exactly it would mean in the first place for consciousness to come in degrees, I think it becomes plausible that most theories entail that consciousness comes in degrees in some way or other. So that basically is my view on this issue. Now, I started this talk by asking the question, does consciousness come in degrees? And I haven't exactly provided an answer. But what I've done here is I've argued that it's not a bad question. Maybe the answer will turn out to be that no creature is more conscious than any other creature, but maybe not. In fact, I think probably not. So I haven't answered the target question, but I have tried to explain how we can think clearly and systematically about this issue. And I've argued that current philosophical criticisms of this question just aren't sustainable. And I've also offered a way of figuring out the answer, namely by looking at our best theories of consciousness, by seeing what exactly they say about what consciousness is, and then by figuring out whether some creatures can have more of that than others. But as I said, I think most theories entail that some degree property satisfies the analysis. And given this, I think that maybe the most interesting question isn't whether consciousness comes in degrees. At least I think it probably does. But instead, what degrees of consciousness actually turn out to be, meaning what property we identify degrees of consciousness with. That's a question that I think is sensible and that's interesting and that I think is something worth exploring. Thank you very much.